On the Season 6 premiere of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast, Leah Obias, Director of Policy and Strategy at Race Forward, sits with Abre Conner, Director of the Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP, to examine how the rapid expansion of AI data centers is reshaping conversations around racial justice, environmental justice, governance, and democracy. As the United States accelerates its investment in artificial intelligence, the physical infrastructure powering it is increasingly becoming a source of public tension and political debate. From rising utility costs and environmental concerns to fights over transparency, accountability, and local decision-making, data centers are forcing larger questions about who benefits from technological expansion and who is left to absorb its consequences. Together, Leah and Abre unpack the growing resistance emerging across the country, from town hall confrontations and organizing efforts to broader legal and policy battles over the future of data center development. They also explore why this moment is increasingly being framed not simply as a technology issue, but as a defining racial justice issue of the present moment. A note for our listeners: Race Forward advocates for the equitable and responsible development and use of AI technologies with a focus on ensuring that innovation does not come at the expense of equity, transparency, or community power. Here's their conversation.
Abre, it's really wonderful to meet you. Welcome to Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. And I am really looking forward to having a conversation with you today about AI data centers as a pressing racial justice issue right now. I thought we could start the conversation by talking about the NAACP's lawsuit against Elon Musk's AI company. This lawsuit was just filed a few weeks ago in mid-April, alleging that XAI is violating the Clean Air Act and operating unpermitted methane gas generators to power a data center near residential communities along the Tennessee-Mississippi border, including historically Black neighborhoods. So as a way to bring us into the present day, can you tell us about that lawsuit? We know the case is ongoing, but what can you tell us about the background of that case and why you all filed it?
First, I'm so excited to be here because I think that the work of highlighting data center buildouts and fossil fuel buildouts, quite frankly, as a racial justice issue is incredibly needed and important at this moment, but then also always. We realized that early in the data center, AI hyperscale data center conversation, that we were seeing many of the same tactics and strategies that had been used by industries in the past, whether it was fracking or crypto mining, being utilized similarly to try to get AI data centers online as quickly as possible. And one of the most egregious ways that we saw that show up was in South Memphis and a historically Black community right outside of Boxtown, which is a historically Black community as well. And our concern was that these AI data centers, which many people have now started to connect the dots, that when you type in your query through AI, that it doesn't actually live in the cloud, right? It lives in a physical infrastructure, that this particular physical infrastructure that was powering AI requests was that this billionaire felt that he did not need to follow the law in order to do so. And you had in South Memphis dozens and dozens of methane gas turbines that were powering Colossus One, which was the first facility. And our branch and our state conference, and then also local resistance, had highlighted that they had a lot of concerns about the lack of transparency, the fact that community was not brought in, the fact that the greater Memphis area has some of the worst air quality in the country, that they had been, the individuals who had to fight back against existing environmental degradation and build out just as recently as a few years before. And so for a tech billionaire to pick that location for Colossus One was concerning. And so we wanted to make sure that we were supporting communities, supporting frontline communities, supporting Black folks who sounded the alarm on what this was going to mean for folks across the country first. And then when Elon Musk, XAI, and MZX Tech decided to move into South Haven right across the state line and try to power up Colossus 2 and have methane gas turbines that were powering a second power plant, we recognized that it was important for people to understand that no one is above the law. Whether you are a billionaire, that does not give you a license to show up in communities and pollute without following just the very basic things that have been put in place. Like the Clean Air Act has been put in place for several decades. And part of the reason why the Clean Air Act was enacted in the first place was because you had industries that were showing up across the country and polluting at such high levels that everyone was getting sick. And they were like, we have to actually do something about this. We need to regulate it. And the Clean Air Act didn't say, oh, well, we're going to leave, Foxtown or South Haven out. And even though our communities had to fight to make sure that people remembered that, we knew that it was important for us to not continue to be left out of protections that were supposed to be for all communities, including those in the greater Memphis area in South Haven, Mississippi.
Thank you. This was a powerful example, I think, of one of the ways in which a community is fighting back. And we'll, throughout the course of this podcast, talk more about other ways that communities have been fighting these data centers. You mentioned the lack of transparency, and there's this aspect of this around the lack of community consultation and the impacts on democracy in general. And we know that AI sits at the intersection of technology, environment, and democracy. So curious, in addition to the lack of transparency that you were mentioning, what are the other ways that the rapid acceleration of AI has impacted communities of color?
It has really been a comprehensive demonstration of what it means to do environmental and climate justice work, which is highly intersectional, from the fact that it is impacting the everyday resources that people have access to, the amount of water that's needed, the hundreds of millions of gallons of water that's needed in order to power these data centers, to the grid, to people's pocket, how they're able to afford things, right? When communities are saying, it feels like my utility bill is going up, even if they don't see a data center, well, they're not wrong because oftentimes, even before a data center shows up, there might be modeling that needs to be done in order for the grid to support a hyperscale data center on the grid. And guess who pays for the modeling? The current ratepayers. And so if the data center is like, oh, we'll explore this. And then the municipality is like, all right, great. Like, let's show you what this would look like. The everyday people are the ones who are paying for that, whether or not they had any input into any of those conversations. It also impacts, we talked about the air quality, right? But it also impacts everyday infrastructure needs. And the use of water can also impact how people interact with the infrastructure that is utilized at the local level. So I remember at the height of the Jackson water crisis, and we were doing a lot of work across the country as well as locally to help people understand how much it would actually cost to actually upgrade or to get a new water infrastructure at just one local level. It's in the billions of dollars. And so if you have a data center that is running and using so much water, that ages that infrastructure more quickly. And so guess what happens when you have a community that already is facing a degradation of infrastructure like their water infrastructure, and now it ages it more quickly? That means somebody has to pay for the new water infrastructure. And who is it? Is going to be the people who are the taxpayers who are in that community. And a lot of times, it's not like the data centers are paying more. In some instances, they're getting tax breaks. And so people are literally paying more for decisions when it comes to data centers showing up in their communities. But again, what we're not seeing, unfortunately, is a comprehensive assessment of what it actually does to the community. So because there's been so many backroom deals, conversations with non-disclosure agreements and, rushed processes, we're also seeing the impact, I think, and this is a good impact, is that people are recognizing their power and they're showing up at city council meetings. They're showing up at planning and zoning commission meetings. They're showing up at permit board hearings. And they're saying, you're not going to move forward with these decisions without talking with us first. And so, even though we talked about some of the environmental and the democracy impacts from a negative perspective, I think it's also creating a window of opportunity for self governance and democracy in a positive way as well, because people are asking questions about how in the world there are municipalities allowing for billionaires to show up in their communities and not include them in the decisions.
I think it's true what you're saying about seeing that these local confrontations at town meetings, that the response in communities has been really inspiring. The on the ground organizing, the neighbor to neighbor organizing. Since you've mentioned some of the backroom deals, you mentioned NDAs, what are some patterns that you think people should look out for, or patterns that you've seen in how some of these projects are introduced into communities?
One thing that is really important is to know that the company that may be involved at the construction permit phase, there might be a different company that's also named by the permit phase or at different phases. And I think that that's important because as you're trying to follow the through line, it is important to look at what the description is as well, or where it might be located, because there are all these like intermediaries and different companies that may be working with a larger tech company in order to get the data center up and running and moving as quickly as possible, and to make sure that you're monitoring from early intervention all the way through expansion. The other thing is not to just take the word of, like a local official. And we love working with many municipalities and elected officials and folks who are in these positions, but asking questions. That is how we were able to actually move some of the processes in South Memphis and in South Haven, Mississippi as well, was by challenging some of the things that were being shared at the community level as the law. And that is literally what our case is about. There was this supposed exemption, and we're like, what, like, show us where you're getting this information from. They're not able to show that. So it's not just taking what someone is saying to you as, what it is. Feel courageous within yourself to be like, I'm going to ask questions. And that, quite frankly, is our jobs, as residents in these places, is to ask questions. It's not our job to necessarily have all the answers all the times. And sometimes we do, but even if we don't, they need to be able to back up their work. They need to be able to show their work for how they reached the decision of potentially rezoning property right next to a school, right next to community neighborhoods in order to put a data center there. Like, they need to be able to explain that. And if they're not, then as residents in that neighborhood, in that community, in that city, in that county, we have the opportunity to say that maybe that's not the right decision, because ultimately the people who live there are the ones who are going to have to live with the decisions of how it plays out in their communities. There is a way at the federal level, but then also at your local and at your state and at your county level, that you can ask for information that you are owed as people who pay tax dollars. So it's different names in different states, but there's these open meeting laws that in sunshine laws that exist that basically say they cannot just have an agenda that no one knows about. They can't just not share meeting minutes, and that you have a right to request that information. And you also have a right to request the documents and the correspondence and the communication that they have as public officials that help to lead to those decisions as well. And oftentimes, we've seen some of these local elected officials act as though that is information that they don't have to share, but that's just not true. And so there are organizations like ours and many others who have been pushing back about that because it is important for people to understand that the community and people power, that's really what's most important. That the folks who are in these elected and appointed positions, they work for us. And that this is an opportunity to remind folks that. It's also a midterm election year. And I know that in every single place across the country, there might not be the same types of elections that are happening, but it's important for us to show up in different spaces and to be educated about who might have different roles in allowing for these projects to move forward. Of course, oftentimes it's our city council members, folks in planning and zoning, our mayors, our governors, but that's also something in addition to the immediate watching that people can do. It's also a way to remind folks who are in those positions that they work for the people on the ground.
I want to spend more time on talking more about the convergence of government priorities and corporate interests and how those collaborations or collusions also benefit from this narrative that this is all inevitable, that this progress is happening, that it's also bolstered by the fact that the federal government is really trying to position the US as a global leader in AI. I mean, Trump has this, I don't know if it was an executive order or a plan that he released. So there's all of these sort of things that are happening that might, and which we're familiar with in the climate movement, feeling like, oh, like the climate disaster is this existential problem that is both inevitable and just so overwhelming and huge to confront, that I'm curious how you're seeing some of these things play out on the local level, because we do know, again, like this is something that people are really taking on at the local level at the same time that there's these big picture things that are happening.
I think that what you're describing is spot on. It's important for us to put in context why we're seeing the convergence of these issues show up at a local level in a way that really we should see alignment all the way through everything that's happening federally and internationally as well. At the beginning of this Trump administration's kind of, highlighting the platform of Project 2025, we did a deep dive into what we thought would likely happen under the energy and the climate rollbacks. We knew that we were going to see more of a push for fossil fuels. We knew we were going to see divestment from clean and renewable energy projects. And we knew that this administration had basically taken that's the stance no matter what. Now, how does that play a role into what we're seeing with data centers and why it's playing out the way it is at a local level? Well, for one, I don't think that this administration thought that it was going to have to address data centers at all to the extent that it had to. And because of the local push and resistance, we actually were able to force this administration to talk about it at the State of the Union and also to pull together the Ratepayer Protection Pledge, which basically just says bring your own energy. And the reason why it says that is because it still allows for this administration to push for there to be more fossil fuel data center build outs that exist at a local level. And so it doesn't change that landscape, but it was something that this administration realized, oh, like we have to address this because people at the ground level are not happy with what's happening with data centers, and people are connecting the dots that it's relating to more fossil fuels, more air pollution, more water scarcity, noise in their communities. So we have that happening all at the same time. We're at the company level and at the administration level, there's this urgency to make sure that we stay in competition with certain other countries in other parts of the world to make sure that we have this dominance of if we slow down in any way, shape, or form, that we're somehow going to be left behind. And this is actually what is needed. If we don't keep up, then we're somehow going to be behind. And like that is like also what's driving the ability for those conversations to happen while like many other people are saying slow down. Now, this is impacting what's happening at conversations at the federal level, but at the same time, we're starting to see more folks at the congressional level, as well as folks at the state legislative level as well, say, well, let's call for a pause, at least like a slowdown for a little bit. And then we've also seen that from certain mayors across the country. And that helped, I think, to make sure that people recognized at a local level that there was at least some understanding that the local resistance is indeed informing the policy conversations that are happening at the local, at the state, and to some extent at the federal with Congress at those levels as well. But how that plays into why people are saying we want more transparency, we don't want more pollution, we don't want you using all of our water, but then you have a president who is still moving forward and having conversations with tech companies and saying we're just going to do this no matter what. I think that people are feeling the frustration though at the local level, and I think that that is why we are also seeing people show up and say that they're going to show up in record numbers and new segments of people saying that they're going to show up in November. And we're also, even before November, we're seeing people like get rid of their local elected officials because of a decision that they made around a data center already. We're already seeing what the writing on the wall is going to look like. But I think that how that's going to impact this year and how it's going to impact further conversations is that the folks who are willing to be courageous and who are willing to align themselves at least with what their communities are saying, that that's going to really be important for many other policy decisions that are going to show up over the next several years when it comes to how we're going to be able to push for any number of other issues. And so I think that this is a real opportunity for people to understand that the data center topic is an opportunity to make sure that when people are showing up to the polls, that they understand the full breadth of all of our civil rights that are under attack. We just had the Supreme Court decision that came down just a few days ago. This is an opportunity to make sure when people are showing up that they're fighting to ensure that they have that level of democracy at the local level and that we're not giving that up to people who may not have our best interests at heart.
Without a doubt, there have been communities that have forced this conversation about data centers, as you mentioned, that the data centers weren't even intended to be part of a conversation around AI in general. And so there is definitely real shifts happening. You mentioned a moratorium, and we've been, sort of talking about some of these town hall takeovers. So I'm curious if there's any particular stories that you wanted to lift up and share a story about an inspiring win.
I would even start with before we even get to the actual opposition, I feel like it was a win that at the very beginning of the AI data center conversation, when folks were figuring out, like, okay, how do we make sure that we align, that civil rights groups, EJ groups, housing rights, labor, so many groups came together. We all came together in South Memphis at Lemoyne-Owen College, which is a historically Black college in Tennessee and in Memphis, to come up with the Frontline Framework, which was the first set of national data center principles that existed at a time where we weren't necessarily seeing that alignment from certain groups that had traditionally been in the forefront for some of the other climate conversations, but that racial justice, civil rights, and EJ groups recognized that we didn't have the opportunity to wait to figure out what the next steps were going to be, and that we made sure that that void did not stay open very long. And I think that that's a win because of the fact that we were hearing from folks who were fighting against data centers from Arizona to Massachusetts to other places in Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, like Georgia, South Carolina, all these different places. And they all at that time felt that they were doing it alone, and that they felt that it was similar to stories that they had heard about from in 1991 when leaders came together and built out the 17 EJ principles, which we still use to this day to make sure that we are aligning the work properly. And we did, develop out the structure for that agenda and for how we were going to reach consensus and how we were able to develop out the frontline framework with consultation from folks who actually developed out the 17 EJ principles as well. And so I found that to be a success because I think that we have to remind ourselves continuously as there are more and more people who are stepping into this fight, which is great, but that this is a civil rights fight. This is a racial justice fight, that we can't lose sight of that as we continue to move forward with ensuring that communities have the ability to govern themselves and that we have this opportunity to fix some of the wrongs that had happened to frontline communities. We've seen historic disinvestment with this administration when it comes to the investments that we saw in the past to acknowledge that yes, frontline communities and fence line communities have had to shoulder the burdens of pollution for so many decades, and there hasn't been any investment there. And now is a time for us to really say, okay, we are not going to allow for that to be a superfluous part of the conversation, but it's going to be central. It's going to be how we guide the work moving forward. And so I think that that's really important because we've seen it show up in so many ways at the work that we do with our coalition partners. There were over 100 folks who were there and local elected officials and different coalitions and just, activists and organizers who were like literally the only ones in their communities. And I think that that was beautiful. I think that that is what allows for us to continue to do this work that feels authentic. And I know that that's how Race Forward also thinks about the conferences and the ways that the convenings happen, because I think that that's how we're going to be able to reach a solution that we can all be proud of.
No, absolutely. I think the Frontline Framework is a beautiful win for our communities, and especially our communities who are facing this lack of democracy with this data center issue, and not just the data center issues, but so many other issues. I mean, so many other realms of our lives where we're not able to meaningfully participate. To be able to hear about how the consultation happened and the different groups coming together to create the Frontline Framework is really inspiring. And for folks, we'll definitely include in the show notes the link to the Frontline Framework. And you mentioned the EJ principles, and could you just sort of describe a little bit for folks who might not be familiar?
What we wanted to make sure that we were doing was to actually develop out principles that came from the EJ principles that kind of oversee how folks, when people are like, what does it mean to do EJ work? There were principles that were developed back in 1991 that kind of oversaw that process. And then you have the Jimenez principles, to your point, that help to ensure that that process was done in a democratic way and that everyone's voice was a part of that process. And so what we did was to actually look at the 17 EJ principles and to figure out like, okay, how do we want to make sure that the conversations that are happening include everything that comes from those 17 EJ principles, and are there any new things that we feel like need to be added to the conversation? So we developed the following principles, and the online, to your point, it expands more into this. But the top lines are that our health and the environment are sacred. Communities most affected must lead. Jobs cannot justify the harm. Accountability must be enforceable. We reject false solutions and fossil fuel dependency. Infrastructure must be community led. Interconnected harms require interconnected solutions. Solidarity builds power, and that we walk our talk. To your point, it's been very helpful, when people are going into conversations to know that there is a North Star and that it also was developed by racial justice, civil rights, environmental justice, climate justice organizations at the helm leading that process. And that there were, big greens that were there as well. And there were many other organizations. But I think that that's how the process was always meant to be within developing the 17 EJ principles. And I feel like given what's happening with data centers, that's who should continue to lead those conversations as well.
Please do check out the Frontline Framework. And NAACP also has a really helpful toolkit around data centers. I do have one more question, and this is about AI use. Our movements and the broader workforce, everyone seems to be exploring how to engage AI in our work, trying to weigh the benefits and the risks, and particularly around job loss and how we can keep our jobs, while at the same time trying to take advantage of some of the efficiencies. Race Forward, we've been emphasizing the need for equitable, responsible AI use, and just sort of curious, like some of this kind of reminds me of some of the ways in which environmental groups or tactics have not gone far enough, and they're more focused on kind of a consumer approach, or everyone just needs to go vegan or something, or just recycle more. How do we move from the individual to a more systemic approach? What would a community centered approach to AI infrastructure look like at a systemic level? Is there such a thing even as responsible AI use in this context?
To your point, a lot of these questions, people are trying to explore them and figure them out in real time, in part because of this race to the top or bottom, depending on who you ask, about AI needing to be implemented and used as quickly and as often as possible, and that we need everything happening right now, right? And so I think one thing is being willing to take that step back and not at the this isn't for the community to do, this is for the companies to do, to be willing to be like, well, do we have the answers right now? Are we willing to be honest with ourselves about what it is that we're creating? And do we actually understand what it is that we're creating? I've heard some folks talk about who are kind of early in the kind of research phases of AI, and that the generative AI that we are seeing now is really not what many folks who were thinking about these issues thought that we were going to be rolling out to everybody. And so I think that there is something to that. We're not anti-tech, and we're not anti moving in a direction that's going to help our communities. And we do have certain segments within our organization who are thinking about how do we make sure that our communities aren't left out of tech conversations, because I think that that's really important, the tech and the innovation component of it. But I do think that there is a larger question to be had around, and this was kind of in the framework, right? Interconnected harms require interconnected solutions. And so if people are talking about the fact that we are moving towards a society where we're not going to have access, people are not going to feel as fulfilled because the jobs that they're doing now are no longer going to exist. And maybe that even that model doesn't include people being a part of whether or not that's what people actually want in the future, to the conversations around what does exist now or what could exist in the future that would allow for people to feel like there is assistance that is coming from technology, as opposed to technology replacing people and replacing ideas and replacing emotion and replacing like the human interaction. Because I think that that is really important at the end of the day for us as people, and as people who are literally just a part of a larger ecosystem, to understand that we are literally that. We're just one part of the ecosystem. We don't control every single thing. And that if we get back to the way that many communities of color have interacted with the earth, that that would allow for us to be able to have those kinds of conversations, as opposed to a more individualistic way of how AI is interacting with one person as opposed to the larger ecosystem. And so for me, that's what community centered means, is understanding what our role is as just people in the larger ecosystem.
Thank you to our guest, Abre Conner, and the NAACP for making this episode possible. Subscribe to Momentum, or Race Forward podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow the work of Race Forward on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. To learn more about the issues discussed in this episode, including the Frontline Framework and ongoing organizing around data center development, visit the resources linked in our show notes. From all of us here at Race Forward, thank you for listening. Until next time, let's keep the momentum going.